This is the third day of the learning unit. Today we're going to talk about schedules of reinforcement in operant conditioning. If you go to the website, the main website, actually this is already learning, so go to the main website, hover over psychology, go to learning. That'll bring you here. The other the whole unit is right here, this video, and then the classical conditioning specific day and the operant conditioning day are both here as well. The operant conditioning today, we talked about the types of operant conditioning. Today, we talk about the schedule. So types is how you condition, like if it's positive, negative, reinforcement, or punishment. And then today we're doing schedules, or when you condition. There are actually five. There are 5 different schedules of reinforcement. Positive does not mean good. Negative does not mean bad, as we talked about last time. Negative just means taking something away. Positive means adding something. Reinforcement is if it's going to make the frequency of the behavior increase. Punishment is if it's going to make the frequency of a behavior decrease. So an example of positive reinforcement would be like a treat or saying good job. Negative reinforcement would be removing a thing you don't want, like positive punishment would be adding something you don't want. That would be like a shot collar for barking or spraying a dog for jumping up on a counter. And then negative punishment would be taking something away that you do want. That would be like taking away your iPad during class. Those are the types of operant conditioning. There's also schedules of operant conditioning. And they also work on a grid like this. But first, most of you probably have dogs that you've, most of you probably have dogs. And then some of you have probably trained your dog to do something even as simple as sit. Sit's pretty easy. In fact, you can train a dog to sit in just probably like 100 seconds. And you can probably successfully train a dog to sit. It's pretty easy using operant conditioning. Train it, reward it using positive reinforcement whenever it does the thing you want. So sit, and then it sits, and then you reward the sit. And it'll eventually link the word sit with sitting down, which is kind of classical conditioning in that way. But let me ask you this. When you're first training a dog to sit, how often would you give that dog a treat when he sits? And probably every time. If you give it every time, it's called tenuous schedule of reinforcement. So that is one option. If it is not continuous, though, it is one of these 4 possibilities, working on a similar grid to the types. It can either be fixed, variable, interval, or ratio. Let's talk about fixed and variable first. Fixed means you know when the reinforcement is going to occur, or like it is a predictable occurrence. You know when you're going to be rewarded. Variable is you don't know when you're going to be rewarded. And all this will make more sense when we start going over examples. So fixed means you do know, or it's predictable. Variable means you do not know, or it's random or unpredictable. Interval is totally based on time. And ratio is, rather than being rewarded purely based on time, you're rewarded after you actually physically do something, not just waiting. So let's talk about examples of these things. Fixed interval. Can you think of literally anything in the world that happens after a predictable or known amount of time happening? So it doesn't matter what you do, you just have to wait and you know when it's going to happen. There's a lot of stuff like Christmas happens every December 25th. You know when it's going to happen. You can't do anything to make it happen faster. You just got to wait. That would mean fixed. We know when it's going to happen. Interval, just got to wait for it. Lunch at McGinnis, or any period happening, or the end of school. Anyway, all that you can look exactly and see when lunch starts at McGinnis. You can't do anything to make it happen faster. It just happens. My paycheck at McGinnis happens twice a month, every month. I can't do anything to make it happen faster or slower. As long as I remain employed, I'm going to get a paycheck on the last day of the month and the 15th. Variable interval would be still based on time, but you don't know when it's going to happen. So it's based on time, meaning nothing you do can influence when it happens, but you don't know when it's going to happen. So think of what could randomly happen after a certain period of time. And that would be like any kind of weather, but let's use earthquakes. Because we had a few years ago, we had some weird amount of earthquakes, and then none since, really. So earthquakes, any kind of weather though. Let's look at fixed ratio. That's being rewarded after a certain amount of times doing something. That would be like punch cards at a coffee place. So like 10 punch equals free coffee. So to get that free coffee at that coffee place, you actually have to do something 10 times and then you get a free coffee. Also, continuous itself is sort of like a type of fixed ratio because you're rewarded literally every time you do something. So it'd be like a fixed ratio, just it happens every time. And then variable ratio would be you have to do something and you may or may not be rewarded for doing that thing. All gambling would fall here. So in order to win at slot machines, you have to play slot machines. Every time you put a quarter into a slot machine or your card or whatever you do and press that button, you may or may not be rewarded. That would be ratio. You actually have to press that button to possibly win at slots, and variable because you don't know if you're going to win. Also, asking another person out on a date would be variable ratio because you have to say, will you go out with me? And they may or may not say yes. A lot of sports would be variable ratio, like home runs. Because you actually have to hit the ball in order to have the chance to get a home run or get on first base or whatever. But you may or may not do that or strike out or anything like that. So that's the schedules of operant conditioning. They are either continuous if it happens every time, or they would be one of these four things if it is not continuous. And similar to the other 2 days, we are also going to do a worksheet which does all this. Well, let's go over a few of these like last time, and we'll do a few together, and then you can do the rest on your own. Similar to last times, there are 2 letters you write on each of these blanks. Your first letter will either be F or V for fixed or variable. Your second letter will either be R or I for ratio or interval. And similar to the types of reinforcement, it also works best if you ask yourself 2 very specific questions. Don't ask them together if it's a little confusing. Ask yourself 2 specific different questions. First being, is this fixed or variable? Second, is it interval or ratio? Once again, fixed means you know when it's going to happen. Variable means you don't know or it's random. Ratio means you actually have to do something to trigger the reinforcement. And interval, time is the only thing that matters. So number 1, getting a paycheck every other week. First of all, is that going to be fixed or variable? Well, do you know when you're going to get paid? Yes, you do. You're going to get paid on the 1st and the 15th. If you're a bad worker, if you're a good worker, there's also nothing you can, it's just always the 1st or always the 15th. So that is fixed. You know when it's going to happen. So the first letter here would be F for number 1. The second letter is either going to be ratio or interval, depending on, do we have to, and this one's a little complicated, but do we actually have to do something to make ourselves get paid, or do we just wait until the 1st or the 15th? And a lot of students will say, well, you have to work your job. That's true. But as long as provided you don't get fired, you just have to wait. You can be a good teacher, you can be a bad teacher. It doesn't really matter. You're still going to get paid on the 1st and the 15th. So unless you get fired, you will get a paycheck. So that would be interval. So that's fixed interval. Number 2, waiting for a teacher to stop lecturing during class. Number 2 and 3 are similar but different answers. Waiting for a teacher to stop talking during class. You could ask the same thing about, when is this YouTube video going to stop? And do you know when this YouTube video is going to stop? Or do you know when your teacher is going to stop talking? You do not. So that would be variable. So the first letter is going to be V for number 2. Second letter, do you have to do something to make them stop talking? Or do you just have to wait patiently and eventually they will stop talking? And hopefully you don't do something to make them stop talking. That would be bad. So interval. So that would be a variable interval. Waiting for a teacher to stop talking during lecture during class. Number 3, waiting for the bell to ring at the end of a class. That's very similar to number 2, but do you know when that bell's going to ring? Yes, you know exactly when the bell's going to ring. So that'd be fixed, but you still have to wait. That's interval. I will probably let you do the rest of these on your own. Once we get back into class, I will go back over all this stuff. So do the best you can and pop this thing into Classroom.